Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. This is episode number 128. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined by friend of the show, friend of mine, our legal analyst here at Last Stand Media. He's generally just a good-looking guy, Rick Hoeg. Rick, thank you for joining me today. How's life?
Hey, I appreciate that introduction. You know, I didn't know if the hat and virtual legality ensemble was going to work for this appearance, but it's basically all I wear for these. So, You know, hey, no, I'm good. I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. You're like a NASCAR driver. We gotta
stay on brand, you know?
Yeah, you got to get you like a Valvoline, patch or something like that. But Rick, it's good to see you. You were just saying you're fresh off vacation, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And this is kind of an impromptu thing that I scheduled with you. Usually we try to schedule these things a little further out.
Right.
But I found that we can, I think, positively engage with a story that's circulating right now, as opposed to just dunking on it, which I want to do that as well. But and the subject, as people know, because they clicked on this already, is I want to talk about both the legality and the morality of emulation, ROMs, piracy, and obviously piracy is illegal. But I wanted to just kind of discuss all of this framed around a story that was at Kotaku, and people can go read about it. It's by a guy named Zach Zweisen. I'm actually going to reach out to him after this just to see if he has any comment that I can stitch to the end of the show if he has. But
sure.
He wrote a story called Metroid Dread is already running on Switch emulators. And I think a lot of people, first of all, Kotaku was trending, which I thought was really interesting, especially interesting during football on either Saturday or Sunday in the States. Very weird for anything to trend has nothing to do with football. And they were trending high based on this story because the story, in my opinion, Rick, overtly tells people how to emulate Switch and links to Switch emulators, and started with this very glib paragraph, which they deleted, and all of the rest. So people can go read that if they want. First of all, were you familiar with the story? Because I texted you off the cuff because I didn't know if you had seen it. Did you see this hullabaloo this past weekend?
Yeah, so I'm sitting at a lake, enjoying my my birthday weekend that my wife had arranged for me, and I'm looking at things.
What day is your birthday?
I'm on the 9th of October.
I'm 14th.
Share it with Scott Bakula. Quantum leap.
Very nice.
So I'm sitting there, I'm watching my Michigan Wolverines and having a rough Nebraska game, and I'm seeing all this kind of discourse. So yeah, I absolutely did see it at the time. But I agree with you. It's odd for it to get trending. And unfortunately, I do think it speaks to some of the incentives. And we can talk about Kotaku. I think they were by far the most aggressive. They were not, and this is an important part of the story, they were not the only ones that went out with a story about Metroid Dread emulation. PC Gamer had one at the same time. There were other folks that were talking about this. Kotaku, in its traditionally abrasive way, was the one that got the most attention, and I think deservedly so. But talking about emulation in general is very often kind of a difficult conversation because, as you said, I think you rightly framed it when we started off. We're going to talk about legality. We're also going to be talking about practicality, morality, whatever it's going to be framed as, ethics. And those aren't always the same. I like to say what is right may not be legal. What is legal may not be right. That kind of thing. So it's part of the conversation, definitely.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you on. You're obviously a lawyer. You have a great mind. And I feel like all of the hullabaloo around this, which I was, I took a swipe at it too. So it's not like I didn't contribute to the toxicity, but I felt like it was just not conducive to, let me back up and say the nature of the conversation, the discourse was not conducive to getting to a deeper meaning, which I think is here. And it's not even about because some people are like, well, Nintendo should sue Kotaku. I'm like, that's first of all, it's not going to happen.
That's how I got framed into the conversation. Actually, was Rick? Can they sue? I was like, well,
yeah.
The First Amendment's going to do a lot of work there.
Right, exactly. And as you said on the show, and as my lawyer said to me, like people can sue anyone for anything. It's not that means nothing. So I wanted to get into the more legal question with you, and then we can also get into the shared moral question or ethical question, as you put it, about what's going on with emulation and ROMs and all of this. Now, I want to. Because I don't think people understand, and I don't understand fully what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, whatever. Now, tell me if my understanding of emulation is right. And I'm just going to frame this from a 40,000 foot place. Creating an emulator is not illegal, and having an emulator is not illegal. It's the use of the ROM on the emulator, right, that would be illegal, and not having the license to use it. So replicating the emulator or replicating the environment which the game exists is not illegal because they're not literally manufacturing the box. They're doing it with software. So that's how I understand it. Is that accurate?
Let me back it down a step.
Please.
Right? So when we're talking about copyright issues, intellectual property issues, I think folks that are familiar, certainly with my channel, I would bet with yours, know that intellectual property in the United States specifically is one of those areas that just doesn't get litigated very often. And there's a whole host of reasons for that when we're talking about these kinds of issues. But one of them is, in general, it's someone with a fairly small interest, an individual user of a ROM, and it's another party with a very big interest, a multinational global corporation. And so you get that cease and desist letter. Generally speaking, you go to talk to a lawyer, the lawyer's going to say, just listen to it. You don't want any part of this fight, right? And so a lot of these issues, we're going to talk about ROMs, come out with, it's probably legal. It's probably illegal. It's probably one of these things. But when we talk about the jurisprudence and how far it's gotten up the courts and whether the conversation has actually been had, there's a ton of gray area on this stuff. Where I can tell you people get tripped up a little bit is with the constant presentation that emulation is legal, like that sentence. And you got it right, I think, for the most part. What the courts have held is that creating an emulator, going and figuring out how something works so that you can use it for a legal purpose is generally legal. But that part that I added in there, which you don't usually see reported or in the sentences on Reddit or where have you, is fundamentally important. This line of cases goes back to things like Accolade versus Sega. They built a Genesis on their own so that they could put games on it. That's legal. That's a legal purpose. Making a Genesis on your own so that you can download a ROM and use it when you haven't gotten a license to it, when Sega has never offered it to you, that's not, generally speaking, going to be considered a legal purpose. Has that been litigated fulsomely? No, it hasn't. Because for the most part, much like we talked about in earlier videos where I talk about largesse, where a copyright holder doesn't want to go after a streamer, regardless of whether or not the license says that you're allowed to stream, it's because you don't like to attack your fans. You don't like to go out there and look like a big evil corporation. And in a lot of these instances, you're not going to go after the ROM user. You might, like Nintendo has made a habit of, go after the ROM distributor. You see them doing that a lot because that's at least some kind of deep pocket. You can make an example out of them. It doesn't necessarily look like you're attacking their true fans. That's how we get into these conversations. But when you talk about, and people bring this up to me on my channel all the time, your Accolade case, your Bleem case, Game Genie, that kind of thing, in every single instance in that jurisprudence, you're talking about a court that finds that for whatever reason, you're doing something that is legal. Bleem is using PlayStation discs. Game Genie isn't interfacing directly with the code and still needs the cartridge and the Nintendo. You have all of these kinds of specific facts and circumstances which govern those questions. So generally speaking, I would say that using a ROM is for the most part going to be a copyright infringement. On a practical level, it's probably not going to be enforced against you unless you're, the Dread Pirate Roberts on these kinds of things. And ethically, I can't speak to anybody's individual ethics, but for me personally, I don't really use ROMs. I don't really use emulation. I'm an officer of the court, all that good stuff. But I think as things get older in time, when they really are genuinely unavailable, when companies have gone under and nobody knows who something makes, I think you start to have more of an ethical position than you do when you're talking about a game that was released on Friday and an article on Saturday.
Right. Yeah. Very well said. I want to get into the whole ethical play later because I think you and I agree. Because just to frame it briefly, like it's illegal no matter what to use a ROM, it seems like. But I think you can kind of forgive yourself.
You can justify a lot of things. Well, and we get into that conversation about, when Kotaku changed its article, and I just was highlighting this on social media, they had a note that was added that says, we're not going to tell you to download things illegally. You might have purchased it or something along those lines. And I'm like, oh, God. So the implication there is the constant question, which is, well, if I have a copy of Kirby's Dream Land and I hold it up to the stream, can I emulate it over here? And the answer is, again, it's not been litigated, but the way intellectual property generally gets distributed, you get a license to do whatever it is with it. You get a license to put that cartridge in your SNES or your Nintendo 64. You don't get a license to dump it to a different method of operation. And that's going to rub people the wrong way. Certainly as they get older and older and older, I understand. I'm not here being the morality police. But as far as the Copyright Act goes, there's really no distinction between it's old and I'm not selling it and it came out yesterday. It's still the copyright holder's exclusive right to control distribution. And that includes not putting it on your PC or not putting it on your PlayStation.
It's interesting because I feel like people that forgive this are not doing the industry any favors by doing it, because I don't think they understand the destructive nature of it. And also, I love what you said, because the great thing, I mean, I remember this back in the 90s, people would be like, oh, I have a ROM of Super Metroid, but I own Super Metroid.
Right.
So I'm like, and I remember people being like, well, you can do whatever you want as long as you own the game already. And I'm like, I don't know, because I haven't emulated any. I had an emulator on one of my PSPs. So that was probably, I don't know, 12 years ago. And before that, I didn't really emulate much outside of NES and SNES, with the exception of when I was in high school, I ripped PS1 discs like left, right, and center, which a lot of people were doing. And I look back at that and I'm like, well, I was like in 10th grade. So
you were ripping them yourself?
Well, yeah. Well, my friend Kevin had like a CDR. So we would go and rent the games, and then he would copy them for us, and then we would return the game, get another one.
Oh,
and
I
we
see.
did this like over and over and over again.
Because one of the things I would say is that ROMs, there's a more tangible legal argument. Again, none of this is litigated. That's, if anybody takes anything away from this, it's all gray area when you get past point.
Well, that's fascinating, by the way. It's just that there is no answer yet, because no one's brought it up, like you said.
And there's unlikely to be. I mean, if you could tell, the Copyright Act itself is from the 70s. There's a vested interest in not pushing these to an actual precedent. It's useful to have a sword of Damocles if you need it, if you're one of the copyright holders. So that's one of the other issues we could talk about. But there is an argument to be had that there's a distinction between taking your copy of Super Metroid, putting it through whatever machine you have, and making a ROM that you can use on an emulator as potentially being legal, versus downloading something else somebody else made. If you go through that first set of precedents, you can start to argue kind of the VHS taping of cable TV shows type of line of cases. The other way doesn't give you that same kind of legal authority. So when you talk about this, if you do it yourself, it's a lot more like recording something off the radio than it is going through another service.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. So yeah, there's multiple errors or ways to remove yourself rather from, as opposed to going to a ROM site, downloading that, then that's one piece of removal, and so on and so forth from the source. Right. I want to know about, how are people getting away with this more broadly? I know you said like it's not popular to go after people and stuff like that, but you also brought up the point that Nintendo, I think, is one of the exceptions.
Right.
Maybe not with the small stuff, but they go after like fan games and stuff, like things that it doesn't matter. I don't understand their point. People seem to be pretty overt about like this article brought out a lot of overt, like, oh, I do this. Oh, I just dumped Metroid Dread and I just did this, this, and this. And I'm like, man, what? Like, so how are people getting away with this in a greater way? It's brazen. Are they, to the point you made earlier, are they just kind of challenging them and saying like, you're not going to go after us? Like, you can't go after us? Because it reminds me a little bit of, why wouldn't they necessarily just want to mail people stuff and be like, very similar to with Napster and WinMX and all, or not WinMX, but whatever it was back in the day, all the peer-to-peer stuff. A lot of people just got letters in the mail from their ISP and scared the shit out of them. That was the end.
Well, and I would argue that it wasn't the end, right? I would argue that if you looked at the analytics of torrent sharing and other things with intellectual property, and I can't speak to the internal data of these companies, the fact that they don't continue that process and they really start aiming directly at the distributors rather than the consumers was indicating to them that they were taking on all the negative aspects of pissing off the fans and maybe not in their internal analytics actually moving the piracy number. Right. For the most part, you can generally monitor those kinds of things. You can know where these things are, give or take, and you can see, especially when you're talking about online games, maybe a little bit harder in the Metroid Dreads of the world, but you can generally tell what exactly your usage is. I had sold an app on the App Store, and you could see people interacting with our leaderboard, and you could see our sales. And it's pretty obvious when you've got piracy problems and those kinds of things. So my guess is that people found that to be not terribly useful. And when you have it spread out, when you have individual pirates, yes, you could go try to make an example out of commenter 6 on the Kotaku article or what have you. But generally speaking, it's going to be an onerous process. You might not be able to find them if they're properly anonymous.
Because you have to unmask them, right? First,
yeah, you'd have to do it you'd have to do like a John Doe filing, or you'd have to go and Nintendo got in trouble for having vans outside of people's houses and things, and not legal trouble, but like journalist outlet trouble. And so Nintendo's constantly kind of framing it as, okay, what's worth it? What's not? How much can we tell this is affecting us? Obviously, Kotaku trending, even with the Metroid Dread emulator, not terrible advertising for the fact that Metroid Dread is out. And if you believe that you can, make that sales pitch to folks that it's worthwhile game to just buy, you can justify things. It's one of those questions, but more than legality is strategy. What is really going to affect people? And so I think you can be brazen on the internet. It doesn't make it more legal, but on any individual basis, for someone that's not downloading 1,000 of these things that you can actually point to, it's going to be a tricky thing to justify to bring an action against at the copyright holder level.
It's interesting because I guess my understanding of it was totally mistaken, because I always assumed that they stopped going after people because they were suing them for extraordinary amounts of money that no one could pay. But what you're arguing is that, and you're probably right, is that these guys are they're still there. I mean, it's just pushed a little bit further underground. I've noticed that when I've gone to look for stuff, the only thing I've ever gone illicitly to look at in the last 10 years probably is a football game. And you can't even do that anymore with Reddit. And that's another example, which we'll talk about later, is I only did that because they just won't let me buy what I want.
Right. And that's part of the conversation.
Right. And that's a major part of the conversation I want to have with you as well. But I noticed that you kind of had to go a few levels deeper than you used to. I remember in the 90s, you could just search on Alta Vista or whatever, Offspring, bad habit. And then there would just be a website and you just right clicked the fucking file and download it from whatever Apache server that the person was connected to. And so now it's just much more difficult. So you're probably right. It's just I'm sure you're certainly right. That has brought that down. But you had brought up the issue, and I don't know if we have any insight into this per se, but I'm wondering, do we have any evidence one way or the other that this kind of stuff does hurt an industry, does hurt something like gaming? Or is the argument that no one is really losing sales kind of true? Because the argument is just the person wasn't going to buy this game anyway, or the person can't afford this game or whatever. And that's a whole nother conversation. But is there any, because this reminds me a little bit of Microsoft and Apple and just the look and feel operating system kind of thing, where they were arguing with each other, but it just didn't really seem to matter at the end of the day. So I just wanted to kick it back over to you and ask you, is there a reason to be upset about this?
Well, I mean, I think anytime you've got a legal right, like you do with an exclusive copyright holder, you don't love not having that right be enforceable for whatever reason, because it's spread out to a bunch of people. And it's generally the case that Congress and the Copyright Act itself exists on the belief that exclusive right helps promote the creation of creative works because you're getting paid for it. And if that gets broken, that you're getting paid less than you might otherwise. I would say that, and I'm not familiar with any studies that kind of talk about this at length, it's kind of an alternate universe scenario problem. It's one of those studies where it's well, what do my sales look like if piracy is zero? How do you establish that? What does that look like? Right. And so I think that's tricky. Certainly there are folks out there that advocate against that kind of thing. So, people were linking me to Gabe Newell saying piracy is a service issue, not a price issue, that kind of things. And you can beat it that way. I would say that it's a very difficult case to prove. It's impossible to prove a negative. So what exactly this affected, how many of those piracy things can I say are sales? Like I said, I put out an app. You could see 60,000 pirates to 6,000 sales. How many of those people would have bought if they couldn't pirate? My guess would be about zero.
Yeah.
But it's
unknowable though.
Yeah, it's unknowable. So it's from a legal perspective, it's certainly a worthwhile thing to pursue if you're a copyright holder, especially I think at the distribution level, the things that you can hit with a DMCA takedown. Hey, if we can find that Metroid Dread copy, you can hit that with a takedown. You could potentially take an action against the server providing and all that kind of stuff. Everybody else, the people that are doing that, you try to make them feel bad. If you're the copyright holder, you try to put forth that this is bad. And hey, I think it has found some purchase with some folks, because Nintendo has been so adamant about saying, look, the Metroid sequel took forever because it's never sold that much. We've never made a ton of money on Metroid compared to cranking out another Mario Party. So, if you love this, buy it. And if you've got that kind of contingent in your fan base, they should fight for you a little bit against kind of piracy and feeding the folks that make the game.
To me, I think Gabe Newell, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think he hits on something interesting, because I think it's true to a degree that it is a service problem. You remove as many barriers as possible and you'll get more sales, presumably. But I also feel like one of the things that people are overlooking, it's almost like kleptomania in a way, and I don't mean to be, melodramatic, but I think some people just get off on doing this stuff. Like I think that they just they like it. They like going on a BitTorrent site and downloading the new PC game for free and knowing that they got one on these companies without thinking of the consequences. And so the reason I asked you about that to begin with was because I'm trying to figure out a way to frame to the audience, like, can I even make the case that it matters? Apart from what you're saying, this idea of well, I own the trademark, I own the game, I own the license, I'm going to take action because I can. That's one thing, as opposed to the people arguing and saying, oh, well, they made X amount of money on it anyway. They made their money. And
Yeah.
I don't know how to effectively tell the audience that this isn't a road you probably should go down once you grow up. If you're 14 or something, I don't give a shit what you do, or in college or something like that. But when you come on, man, So
that's the thing. I said, I went out on social media and said, look, it's normal to want things. It's easy to justify stealing. I want it. I should have it. I get that. But these people are devoting their lives to willing the thing that you want into existence. And if you continue to cut off the profit motive, if you continue to cut out their ability to make a living from that, then ultimately you're not going to have things that you want anymore. They're not going to be made. They're not going to be willed into existence. And I think when you ask the question, does it affect people? The folks that are watching your show, the folks that are having this conversation that are interested in the gaming industry, I would say that piracy probably does affect that particular kind of person. That those are the folks that probably would get it if it ever had a sale, or would be looking at the game marginally and know that they would buy it if it was at the value proposition that they like. What they're mostly objecting to is that they would prefer not to pay that amount of money. And I get that. I understand that. But when you're talking about, if I were looking at a game and said, it's just not worth $60 to me, and I wait out the sale and I feel good about it when I get it for $20, if I had instead pirated that, that's $20 that doesn't go into the publishers and the developers' hands. And I think people, when they are honest with themselves, can look at it and say, yeah, I probably would have bought this when that happened. And, some pirates will tell you, well, if I really like it, then I wait till it's at the number I think is appropriate and I buy it. But it's not really up to you at a fundamental level. So I think it's always worthwhile to at least try to establish the legal parameters. And then ethical parameters are going to vary by person. And the practicalities here, as I think you said when you asked me about why these people are so brazen, is that it's not going to make sense 99% of the time for a copyright holder to really make a big stink against a given person.
Yeah, unless you're confident that you're going to make an example of this person and it'll work out. But I imagine it won't. And similar to the Kotaku article, and I think what made people so angry about it, or some people, was it just alerted people that they can even do this. I mean, I must admit, I'm in the industry. I had no idea that Switch emulation was so sophisticated. I had no idea. I knew that. I'm sure people are trying to crack it open all the time. But so there's like there's almost like, that's what I didn't like about that article, by the way, more than anything, was that I thought it was a wink and a nod, glib sort of thing. And then they won't own what it was. And
but that first paragraph was like, Nintendo lawyers look away or something. It's like,
yeah, like if you're a Nintendo lawyer,
all right then.
Yeah, it's very, very, very weird and very amateur sort of move. But I really like what you said very early on about the jurisprudence in terms of like the legal question is unanswered. Really,
Yeah,
like we have the hypothetical, the framework, but we don't know how it would play out. So.
Well, format shifting, which is what you're talking about. You're taking, the Game Boy games are the ones that I like to use because people have asked me this question for 3 solid years now, which is, if I hold up the Game Boy game to camera, can I play it on stream? And I'm like, well, chances are, from a legal perspective, the answer to that question is no. They didn't license you the right to move it over to a different format and then to stream it out. Streaming, it's its own issue. So let's pretend you're just playing it for your own pleasure. That said, there's a cognizable format shifting argument that I can imagine that does look like recording music off the radio. And if you want to say, hey, that's my personal ethics and I'm advocating for that, I can't tell you that a court would necessarily disagree with you, especially if you made it yourself. When you start using distribution sites, that's when it becomes a bigger problem. Either way, you're living in the gray area. So a lot of what's going to control here is, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about your effect on the market? And I'm willing to bet that, you're playing a 20 or 30-year-old Game Boy game, you're going to be more okay with it than if you just took Metroid Dread this weekend.
Right. I think time is everything, and access. I really do believe that. And obviously time will ultimately be everything, because all this will ultimately, it's hysterical to think about, but it'll all be in the public domain one day, which is awesome.
Yeah, we'll be dead, but yes.
Yeah, but it's amazing to think about that, right? Like one day, every game on PlayStation will be in the public domain. one day.
Unless
If we still are
Disney
here.
extends it to 1,000 years, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Like things will. It's just I love that. Like I love. So you see a lot with classic books. You can go
Yeah.
buy a very cheap copy of the book,
Absolutely.
but you can just download it for free. Too.
Yeah.
So
Some of the library projects are really great at that. Absolutely.
definitely. So as we've gotten away from the nebulous legal question and gotten more into the ethical question, I want to frame like the way I feel about this and see if you agree.
Okay.
And I suspect you will, but a few months ago, I didn't, again, I cover PlayStation, and this just goes to show you how fucking ignorant I am on piracy. Apparently, if you crack open your Vita, I'm loath to even tell people this, but apparently if you can crack open your Vita, there's basically like a parallel PlayStation store where you can get everything for free. Like it literally interfaces like the store. Okay. And instead of buying something, you just download the games. And someone told me that my games are on there. And that really annoyed me. Sure. I know that there's nothing I can do about it, and I'm sure that not many people are fucking hacking their Vita open to play Habroxia. But, although you should play Habroxia, of course, but I feel like people don't think about it, and I wanted to bring this up because it's me, guys. It's Colin. Like, you know me. People are stealing my games.
Yeah.
And it's my work. It's our work. It's Barry's work. It's Lily Mo's work. We are selling this game on the market. And my argument is, you don't have a PlayStation 4, you don't have a Vita, you don't have a Switch, you don't have an Xbox, fine. The game's on Steam. And I wanted to see if my reduction is something that vibes with you, which is that if a game is on Steam, I think that's the lowest barrier possible to overcome, to say like there's absolutely no ethical reason or excuse for you to be pirating this game. And I understand that argument is therefore parlayed to Nintendo, where they say like, well, we can't get Metroid 2, or we can't, whatever they're looking for, fucking Metroid Fusion or whatever they want.
Right.
But you brought it up earlier, and I just don't think people get it. Just because something isn't available doesn't mean you have a right to have it.
That's
to
correct.
Acquire it, buy it, or play it. And
yeah,
so go on. I'm struggling to really articulate how to get this across to people. And I wonder if maybe by making it a little more personal, it'll work. What do you have to say about that?
Right. Well, I mean, I think your personal experience matches mine, right? I'm perfectly calm about it now. This is from 2012. But when we were looking at those numbers coming in, when we were seeing the pirates before we got the report from Apple, we're like, we did it. We're going to be able to fund this company to make the next game. And this was my brother mostly developing it, and he's not doing it anymore. He's working for bigger companies. But it was when we got that report back, absolutely, it's irritating. You looked at 66,000 sales. You're like, all right, this is going to work. And then you get back 5,100 sales the next day, and you're like, what? And people are playing that game that you worked on, and that, for my brother's case, you ate ramen for a year, and you tried to build as a dream kind of project, and people are just like, yeah, it looks interesting, I'll try it out, and not pay you. I understand that irritation. In terms of communicating to people about this question, I mean, you have to start with the one foundational principle, which is when you make something, you get a copyright in it, and copyright is the right to copy. It's exclusively held by the creator. And so they get to say, we don't want to distribute it on Steam. Maybe they're more worried about piracy on computers, that it's more of an avenue somehow, that Steam won't protect them properly. Maybe they don't like how their game looks on Steam. Maybe they don't like how something else functions in that environment. And they always felt that it was a console TV experience. I don't care. It's up to them. And similarly, if they don't want to sell it to you there, they might want to do it in the future. Imagine if you had justified getting Days Gone, one of my favorites. I like to use it because people hate it when I say that. So imagine you're playing Days Gone and you say, you know what? Sony's not going to bring that to PC. I will just go download I want to play it on my PC. It's evident now that you have affected the market that Sony wanted to enter 2 years later. And that's the same across all kind of scores. You might not have ever thought you'd see Castlevania Advanced Collection ever in your life, but Konami had a reason to sell it, and that market exists because they got around to it. I don't love how Konami has its business model functioning, but you can see how those markets exist even when they're not being serviced. And that's up to the copyright holder. You don't have to love it. In fact, you can advocate for reform of the Copyright Act. Depending on the reform, I might back you up. But as it stands right now, they have exclusive rights to decide when they're selling something. It's how the Disney Vault worked since they invented it. We like to hold it out for 7 years and sell it back to you.
Those are the worst.
You don't have to like it. I don't like it. I think Disney's the worst in many, many aspects. But that's what they devoted their resources to. That's what they built when they made this thing that they made. And if you change that, chances are you are going to have fewer resources. You're going to have less investment in certain aspects of that if they can't control it. If there's a rule in the Copyright Act that says if you ever aren't selling it, that people can steal it whenever they want, that's going to change how business models function. That's going to change what resources go into things, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. You kind of have to go through all the first and second order functions when you're thinking about a change like that. But at the end of the day, copyright is the right to control how your thing is distributed, sold, copied, and experienced by people. And that right now is the law of the land, that the folks that make it get to decide how that looks.
And that just makes perfect sense to me. And I understand people have these, you brought up in a library earlier, video stores, all these things that were very contentious at various times with copyright law, most recently, I guess, in the 80s. And I feel like people bring up this reference of like, well, you can go to Blockbuster and buy, could have rented Mega Man 2 or something. And I'm like, but Capcom might not have liked that was possible. And Nintendo might not have liked that was possible, but there was a point of sale and it was legal. And so I try to hearken it to, and I don't know if people want to hear this or not, but it's like you're walking into my office here and just taking a copy of Hyroxia and leaving with it.
Sure.
I don't know what the difference is. So the difference, I think and this goes into the older game argument, and what I want to get into next with you about the ethics is, if we were to say if Hyroxia was just not available anymore. Now, I would argue to the point earlier, so what? That's too bad. But that's when I think the morality bends, and where I'm like, I don't really care at that point, because you have to be. I don't think people realize, first of all, I know you know more than anyone, the licensing issues galore behind the scenes of why a lot of these games don't come out or disappear from storefronts and reappear and all that. But also, I'm not going to cry a river if some defunct company like Sunsoft or something, you go play Batman Sunsoft. That's never going to see the light of day ever.
Right.
So do you agree that, and as a lawyer, I'd be really interested to hear your answer to this question, that though possibly literally illegal, we can certainly turn a blind eye, and I think reasonably so, when someone is like, this system's dead, there is no virtual console for it, who even knows who owns the license to this, it's never going to see the light of day. I think at that point you can start justifying it.
I think you can always justify it to yourself in any number of circumstances, as I think I mentioned earlier in the video. So one of the things that I've got is I'm an officer of the court. I'm barred as a lawyer. So I have to say it's illegal, which I think it is really on fundamental levels. And then we can talk about the practicalities, whether they're going to come after you or not. And then the ethics, I think you make a good case. I can't tell you to do something. I can't tell you I recommend it, because it probably is infringement. It probably is a violation of the copyright holder's interest. But as things get more separated out, especially if you've got things like orphan works, right, where nobody even has any idea who owns the thing. I would kill to play a high-res, high frame rate version of No One Lives Forever. I loved that game. And it is in intellectual property hell. That's never, ever, ever going to be released ever again, because nobody can figure out who owns it. And the reason that works that way is because if you can't figure out who owns it, you don't know who to license it from. And if it's successful, people come out of the woodwork. Suddenly They realize they've got paperwork that says they have an interest in this thing. Please share our money. And so that becomes a problem. And I get it. I get the position there. I get the morality even of current stage stuff. I get the morality of some extent of saying, look, I bought a copy of Metroid Dread. I bought 2 just to feel really good about this. And then I'm using the ROM because I want to see it on my PC. I understand how people get there. I really, really do. And as we talked about, my defunct app game company, we haven't paid our Apple licensing fees. We turn those off. You can't get our games. If you could find them on some site, great. Tell people about them. We really are proud of them. So it's I understand that, but I also understand that people can justify things and not be so good faith as we might be having in this discussion. And so I really do think people at least need to understand what kind of concept, ethical, moral, legal, they're breaching, to at least weigh it in their heads. I truly believe that a lot of people are good faith actors, and they'll weigh it, and they might weigh it differently than me. But if they have the understanding of what it is they're actually doing, that this really is, if they would have bought this thing and they're not now taking food out of people's kitchens, then you'll at least think twice about it and have the conversation. And unfortunately, the Kotakus of the world going out with this kind of thing, encouraging that brazenness, I think puts people in the wrong understanding of, hey, if I'm doing this, I should at least be going through the process of justifying it to myself. That it is at least something that's maybe a little bit wrong. It's a little bit sketchy for reasons X, Y, and Z that we've talked about in this video. And maybe because it's unavailable, it's old, this company's not going to come back, it's an orphan work. Maybe I can say, okay, I'm uncomfortable with it myself in this instance. But people really should be going through that process before just saying, nobody would have bought it, nobody's hurt. I wanted to play it in 4K, and if they wanted me to buy it, they should have provided it for it in that way. It's like, they didn't build it for that. Who knows whether they're happy with how it looks, how the smoke effects look on that emulator. That's artistic vision, bare minimum. So it's hard for me because I do have that legal obligation to tell you it's not obviously legal in so many instances. But I also get where people are coming from. And you come to me and say, I want to hold up my Tetris cartridge and play Tetris. Yeah, okay. I understand.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's funny. You're totally right. Like where you do have this fiduciary obligation on one hand, and then you have this more humanistic notion, I think, of like almost code of thieves style thing where you have to justify it to yourself. Like everyone has to write out what they're okay with in their own mind and what they're not. And I wonder if maybe the solution, is fucked up as it is, it's almost like asking the victim to like wear another sheet of armor or something like that. But do you think that the solution to this could be greater accessibility? Because even though, as you noted, people still pirate music and movies and TV shows, I have to imagine that iTunes itself was a revolution in saving the music industry. I think everyone kind of acknowledges that, and kind of tempted you with saying like, come on, man, it's $1, for a song. Like it's $1. And I remember when that came out, I was like, that's still a lot of money. But now that I'm an adult, and it's like, it's an irrelevant amount of money, really. I wonder if Nintendo was just more forward with a virtual console, if Steam had greater access to older games and maybe even emulated older platforms like Apple II and emulated, Commodore PET and all this kind of random shit. I wonder if you just take all of the excuses away, thus that there's always going to be people that steal, but maybe you capture a certain group of people that say like, this is authentically theft, because now it is so easy that I am now just doing it to save the money. Do you think that, in other words, the responsibility might just be with the IP holders to save themselves?
Well, I mean, I think that they could certainly improve the situation in certain important ways, like making things accessible. I mean, I think in an ideal world, you would have some kind of clearinghouse where you could have the equivalent of kind of YouTube content ID claims that says, hey, if somebody's stealing it and it goes out the door, I can put a flag on it and I can get some compensation or money somehow out of that process. It's a little bit trickier for what we're talking about because there's not ads and things like that. But if you look at how the YouTubes of the world work, you've got all sorts of things that are technically infringement, whether it's movie trailers or music things that aren't properly licensed. And for the most part, your content holders are okay with it because they flag the thing and nobody's going to jail or anything. They just say that that's ours and the fees should go to us. Obviously, that can be abused, but if we pretend it's a perfect world, that's a process that's pretty amenable to most people. I got to make my thing. It's not my thing. They should get the money for it. Okay. And maybe I get some more subscribers and we build the model that way, whatever it might be. I think for intellectual property, you're looking at a Copyright Act from the 70s that definitely is in need of reform. I think one of those reforms could be some kind of centralized notion of, especially for orphan works, that says, well, if nobody can claim this thing, we're not going to just leave it sitting out there doing nothing. And so you should be able to go and tell the Copyright Office or something like that it is an orphan, and people get 180 days, whatever it is, to go and claim some portion of it. And if they don't, then it becomes public domain. You have a similar concept with things like real property, right? We can't just have land sitting out there where nobody knows who owns it. Nobody's paying property taxes. Nobody has any interest. So what we do with real property is we have clearinghouses that say, essentially, if this is yours, show us the deed, come get it. If it's not, we're going to have a timer and a notice window, and then it's going to be sold to somebody. And I think you could take on other property law concepts and get it baked into this copyright concept, because you do have so many problems with what can I do with things if somebody's not offering them. Now, as I said, I think you can go too far with that. I don't think somebody not offering something for maybe even 5 years is the type of situation where you can say, okay, it's okay that I take something, because video games have proven to be lucrative, sold in collections from the Game Boy era, the Game Boy Advance era. Virtual console. I mean, Nintendo was still selling things for $7 from the N64 era.
Yeah.
And so there is a market there. You can't just come to me and say, well, they aren't selling it, so they can't ever. So that's not how it works. So I do think there's a compromise to be had there. Copyright holders should be at the table. People interested in those things like archiving video games, folks like that should be at the table. Unfortunately, the law moves really, really, really slowly. And so, I'm not in the business of legislating. I'm not a legislator. I'm not in Congress. So I can point out these issues. I can point out issues with the DMCA, that kind of thing. But it's going to take a while on all those scores.
It does seem like with many things, the onus might be on Congress, to your point, to maybe modernize and standardize these things a little bit more. I don't think people think about, this is just an aside, a tangent, but also the in case of emergency break glass situation that I think a lot of these companies are in terms of like, now that Switch is ubiquitous, now that PS4 and Xbox One, obviously moving forward, ubiquitous, Steam ubiquitous, you really only have one shot now to release a game. Then it's there. And you don't have this thing of being like, we're going to release Super Mario World again. It's like, well, it's already on Switch. We don't need you to release it again. So I think that is part of the angle of why they've been so remiss, in addition to the licensing issues and all of that, is that they're just like, we might need to do this one day. We certainly don't need to do it right now. So I want people to think about that as well. But it does seem that maybe it actually reminds me a little bit of the ESRB in the sense that maybe the best way for the industry to save itself is to acknowledge that it needs to do something to save itself. And I'm not saying that it needs to save itself from existential crises, but I do think it's weird that when you hear about Chinese intellectual property theft, or you hear about whatever the case might be going on, they're never talking about video games, even though we just saw last week Tencent straight up ripped off Final Fantasy XIV in a massive way. And so I was thinking about that too, about the blind eye turned towards some bigger actors at the sake of going after the people making Metroid fan games and all of that, and the fucked up nature of that. But I wanted to ask one last thing, and we can talk about other things if you want, but in terms of the morality play, could it go the other direction where, could you imagine a situation where a company might, and this is again not asking you as a legal analyst, but as just a gamer,
Sure.
Do you think maybe the result will be like we just make our whole back catalog like free or free to play, subscription based, something like that? I would love to see a company do that, where they're just like, fuck it, we've been lying to you for years. Obviously, we have all of these games. Just remove the barriers to entry. Do you think that maybe, again, we were talking about fighting hard? Do you think maybe the reverse could be true, to not fight at all? Do you think that?
I think you'd have to justify it, right? I mean, we talk about business judgment and these companies trying to make profits for their shareholders and continue to exist. So if you've got this backlog, you've seen people selling Game Boy Advance collections and Nintendo slowly meting out little treats and making money potentially on that. You'd have to justify it. How does this help us as a business? I am not saying it's impossible to justify, because bare minimum, you might have a big goodwill explosion. You might be able to say, this is what we think is going to happen. People are going to really like us. They're going to buy our next thing.
Right. Force multiplying in some sort of way.
Yeah. I mean, you think about, let's take CD Projekt Red, which, is bad now. But when they released those DLCs to The Witcher 3 for whatever it was, like $25 for just dozens of hours of content, that's how you got that reputation, is that they're over delivering. They're doing something that they could have charged more for. And I think you can absolutely have companies take that tack and say, we want you to feel good about us because that's how we sell you 15 million copies of Cyberpunk, right? That's how that story is told. It certainly wasn't on Cyberpunk. So you have that kind of business plan that you could absolutely have that says, look, we got this backlog. People love our old stuff. Let's get that out in front. Let's establish ourselves as the people that are pro gamers. It's for the gamers, as an old saying might have gone, right? And we can get that out the door. And then people are feeling good about our brand, our logo, our trademark, and we can sell them the next thing. So I think you can make the case, but the accountants and the bean counters and the CFO are going to want to say, well, okay, wait a minute. Whoa. That's great. Why not 99 cents? Why not $4? Why not $7? What? Right. How did we arrive at free?
Right, exactly. Like, you don't. Yeah, it was just a thought, because I was just like, man, maybe maybe it's the company that does the exact opposite that wins. But like to just be like, fine, man. I mean, because in some way it is a compliment. I get that. But I'll tell you right now, if I found out, and I told you already that I know that people are stealing our games, but if I could easily go after someone that was stealing our games, I would. Like,
you just pick one out. You just take
like,
one of the downloads.
I knew someone was hosting our games. Yeah. I wouldn't sue them for money or whatever, but I would certainly like strike them. And I think that in some way you have to kind of accept it, but on the other sense, it's why I kind of make an example of people on Twitter every once in a while. It's like, you have to know that it could happen. It could be you. I think it's actually cleaned up and made my Twitter experience much more peaceful. I wonder if, on the other hand, Nintendo has made their existence even more peaceful than it would be, because they're the most honored amongst emulated entities, that they were like, yeah. So I just want, to me, I wanted to just have you on because I feel like this is such an open-ended and fascinating question that is both legal and philosophical. And I don't know, as a creator, you're a creator. Here's the one, this is a tough thing to say, but I want to say this to close, and I'll let you say whatever you need to say as well, because you might not want to be associated with what I'm about to say. But
oh, good. It's a good preface.
Yeah. One of the excuses I always hear out of people's mouths with this is, I can't afford it when it comes to piracy. And my honest answer is, too bad. Like that to me is a ridiculous claim. People that are trying to claim like, oh, I've owned the game, I bought it on Wii, I don't want to buy it again, whatever. Okay. But if your argument is like, I can't afford it, that's just a bad argument. You know how many things I can't afford?
Right.
Like so my argument here is like, you got to get a hobby you can afford, or do what Mr. Hoeg said here and play the sales game. Now, I know that doesn't happen very often on the Nintendo
on Nintendo, right?
Side,
yeah.
But on the indie side, it does, and on the third party side, it does, and on the other platforms, that happens all the time. You can get everything for fucking basically nothing if you wait long enough.
Right.
So I just wanted to throw that out there, that if that is your excuse, I really want you to think about it again, because it's a bad excuse, and it can be justified for all sorts of theft. And by the way, it can be justified for theft that would be a lot more righteous than stealing a video game. So that's why I don't like, because I can say like a poor family would be like, I can't afford food, I'm going to go steal the groceries.
Sure.
That's about 25 times better than you stealing a video game. And
games are luxury goods. There's no question.
Right. Exactly. So I wanted to just throw that out there. I probably should have said that at the top. I want you guys to, if any of you make that excuse, and it would be surprising if anyone in this audience did, but I want you to dissuade yourself of that, because it's not a good argument. You know me well enough, guys out there, to know I'll tell you when your arguments are good and when they're bad. That's a fucking bad argument. And money is no excuse, because things cost what they cost. The access question is a much more compelling question to me. And that's why, in my opinion, there's no excuse to pirate Lilymo games, because they're all on Steam. They're all on PS4. They're all on Switch. They're all on Xbox One. Don't steal my fucking games. Rick, do you have anything that you want to end with?
One, I want to disclaim that I've ever stolen any of your games, obviously, for sure. Two, yeah, no, I mean, I think you know this about me. My background is not just law. I have an economics degree. And one of the definitions of economics I always really liked is it's the study of unlimited wants against limited resources, right? Like that's where prices come from. Is it took a certain amount of time to pay a certain amount of people a certain amount of money to make the thing that you want. And that does mean that your unlimited desires. I would love that lake house I was just at. I would love it. I'm never going to be able to buy that lake house.
Right.
Okay. So I would love that, but that's the nature of things. And heck, you might get in comments, or I might get in comments, a discussion of the merits or lack thereof of capitalism, because this is where this tends to lead.
Whatever.
But regardless, that's what economics is. That's how it functions. And yeah, the one thing I will say is I agree with you entirely that it's not a good argument. I will also add the empathetic response, which is I understand that it sucks. I understand wanting something really, really badly and not having it in my pocket, or maybe having to save it for something more important. And I get that. And I get the human condition is to figure out a way to justify that. But I agree with you. It's the case that you're always going to want something that you can't have. And it's better to understand that and to live within your means, but to also just be able to frame out what it is you want to spend your money on. And you can't just justify it by saying, I can't afford it. So I'm with you on that. I I understand, and certainly there's a whole study of economics about whether or not there's dead weight loss and things on pricing, where somebody would have higher utility than somebody that can afford something for any given good. But that's not the way that this all works. So I'm with you there. I think my takeaways from a legal perspective is definitely, I think when we were chatting about this, when we were setting up this video, there was a bit of surprise around the fact that, making an emulator, technically emulating something probably legal, going and getting a ROM, doing what you or I might do with an emulator, probably not. And then this lack of jurisprudence in this gray area, all being something that's important to understand about this issue, which is, Accolade can go make something to figure out how a Genesis works. You playing Switch games on your computer, definitely not as clear cut for the court, and leans in potentially a problematic area for you. So from my perspective, most of this stuff is going to be illegal under the current Copyright Act. I understand how you get there. I understand how people get so vociferous about it, but I am going to stand up for, if you like it, if you want the industry to thrive, if you really like Metroid Dread. And I got to tell you, Colin, I'm adoring Metroid Dread.
I've heard great things about it. Wonderful things.
One of the best Metroids I've ever played. I want to see that game's sequel. I want to see Nintendo want that game. I've said for forever, unfortunately, I've had the money to do it. I want to pay for the industry I love. I want to buy everything that I can. And I will continue that. I bought, not everybody likes these games. I really like Ubisoft open world games. I got Far Cry 6. Far Cry 6 is going to cost, I don't know, 25% of what they just sold me it on Black Friday, like next month.
Yeah, definitely.
Like I know I'm stupid about this stuff, but I like to support that kind of thing. And I will continue to do so. I always have.
I'm totally with you there. And again, like you said, we're in a more blessed position than we were when we were younger, but I spend hundreds of dollars a month on video games.
Sure.
And I often go and buy games day one intentionally, as we talk about on Sacred Symbols all the time, because I want to pay the maximum amount. I did it with Alan Wake. I did it with Far Cry 6. I did it with a bunch, Deathloop, which I finally got to, etc. So it's interesting. And I do want to, because you make a good point, and I want to amend something, my stance, which is when I was 15 copying those PS1 games, and you said to me, there's a consequence for the industry, I'd be like, I don't care. I don't even know what you're talking about. That's why I bring up the argument that it's not a good argument. I was 15. If you're making the argument that a 15 or a 16 or an 18-year-old would make, you're probably not making a very good argument. So it's not to say that I never did those things. And it's very similar to like with the global warming debate. It's like, we're done with our industrialization. Everyone stop, and it's like, well, I didn't have my industrialization yet. And it's a similar thing with maybe the youth, where they're like, we haven't gotten a chance to sow our wild piracy oats. And I'm like, okay, cool. But just think about those consequences, because they're real. And I wish I was smarter as a kid, because I say that I copy those games not out of pleasure or glee. I say it because it's a confession, and one that I'm not necessarily very proud of. So it's a lot of interesting things for people to keep an eye on here, Rick. And I appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk ourselves through. I said earlier that I was going to reach out to Zach at Kotaku. We barely talked about his story, so I'm not going to reach out to Zach. That's one less thing I have to worry about today. But Mr. Hoeg, I really do appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
For those few people that are listening that don't know who you are, where can they find your content if they want to follow more of you?
Absolutely. Well, I'm available on Twitter predominantly as my social media outlet at Hoeg Law, which is HOEG Law. And then what I do in my spare time when I'm not practicing law directly is I have a series on YouTube called Virtual Legality, where we talk about what I think are fairly complicated and interesting legal questions and business questions, hopefully through a prism of stories that you're otherwise interested in. So we just either is uploaded now or yet to be uploaded, depending on when this goes out, did a video on the fact that the state of California may be in real trouble with its Activision case, because they pissed off the EEOC, and the EEOC came full blast back at them. And so that's an hour-long video. If you're interested in that kind of thing and the progress of that case, that's the kind of thing we talk about over there, as well as my most popular video of the year, how to get Sora into Smash Brothers. So you can check that one out as well.
Oh, man. Yeah. Go check out and support Rick's work. I really think that this level of work is so important. And there is so much trash out there, and that's fine. But I feel like we could do better, and we did. So I hope everyone enjoyed our conversation. Rick will be back, of course, for more legal and economic issues, as well as for our Gamescast Gamescast. No, not Gamescast. Spoilercast discussion. What is Gamescast? Oh, that was my old show on Kind of Funny. Our Spoilercast and review discussion. So we'll have him for that as well. So you'll see him much more. Rick, you got a lot of love here in the last.
I appreciate it. I thank everybody. Yeah, I do check in when I can. So I'm very thankful for everybody that comments and says nice things about me. I'm also thankful for people that criticize me. You only learn from criticism, so it's all good.
That's true. Constructive criticism. Well, okay. We appreciate you. We'll see you next time for more Sacred Symbols. Good. Plus, you'll see Rick soon. You'll see me on Sacred Symbols later this week. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.